Hi and welcome to the Geek Legion of Doom. Today I'm going to be having a look at Being Human. Now, I'm not going to be having a look at an individual episode as such, I'm just going to be having a look at the series in overview and also comparing it to the US version. So here in the UK, unfortunately, this series is actually coming to an end and it's disappointing for us UK fans, but the US series is going to be airing on the UK TV soon, so is it worth watching? And also, if you're a US fan and watching that version, is it worth having a look at the UK version? Now, there are some differences, and I would say there's some advantages of both series. So let's have a look at some of the differences between the two shows. Now, first of all, we'll have a look at the different races that are in the show. Now, it primarily focuses on a werewolf character, a vampire character, and a ghost character. And the central premise of both shows is that what would happen if these three sort of characters, or one of each of these three characters, were sharing a house, and it's basically their trials and tribulations of what would happen. Now, the UK show's been going a little bit longer than the US version, obviously. Now, if you're a US fan, just as a side note, and you do watch the UK version, you may not be aware there is actually a separate pilot episode that was shot sometime before the actual series started off proper, and it actually has a different actor and actress cast as the vampire and ghost roles, and it's very different. So just as an oddity, it's worth having a look at. It doesn't form part of the main story, because as I say, it does have different actors in it. So, but it's worth having a look at, and if you as a UK viewer may not even be aware of that. So what I'm going to have a look at really is some of the differences between the two shows, and in some respects, also the US version does it better, and in some respects I would say the UK version does it better, and you can make your own mind up and hopefully tell me what you think. So as a species, in the vampires in the US version, one of the key differences here is that the blood that obviously they sort of suck out of humans or whatever is actually a food source that they actually kind of need, really, to, rather than the UK version. It's more of a kind of a substance that they could possibly do without, but it's like this the most addictive type of super heroin drug or whatever that you can kind of imagine, and it's like and then vampires got hooked on it, but don't necessarily need it. There's also some other sort of minor differences with vampires as well. For example, in the US version, vampires can actually be seen on video, and that will come into effect through a plot point. And also in the UK version, they're invisible on video, and again that does come into effect in the plot in the UK version. Another sort of differences between the two versions is werewolf blood. So in the US version and the UK version, it is both harmful to vampires. However, it's significantly more harmful in the UK version, where it essentially instantly kill you if you're a vampire, and even a small amount, it would essentially, they liken it to drinking acid. Whilst in the US version, it basically just makes them really ill and kind of bleed from the eyes and the ears and stuff like that. But it doesn't look like it will kill a vampire, at least not in any sort of anything but a huge quantity. In regards to the werewolves themselves, they look very different in both versions. So in the UK version, the special effects are basically a man in a suit, and the actual werewolf looks very different as well. So in the UK version, the werewolf is probably larger and is biped. So in the US version, they're more dog-like, and they're CGI creations, and probably larger than obviously a normal dog, but not quite as big as the sort of the UK equivalents. So they're quite different, really. The werewolves look very different. Obviously, they're both animalistic and kind of like savage beasts, but they physically look different. However, the ghosts, there are some small minor differences, but they generally speaking, the ghosts are kind of the same thing. They kind of obey the same sort of laws and things like that. Now, the style of the two shows is, I would say, has some differences as well. Now, if I start with the US show first, so I found the US show, and I've watched them both. I watched both the UK series and the US series, both up to the most recent episodes. So I would say that the US version is probably a little bit more dramatic than the UK version. It's certainly darker in tone. The music, I would say, is a lot more sort of downbeat and kind of almost depressing in a way. However, I would say it's maybe the actors and the cast are maybe a bit more glossy and kind of like sort of typical Hollywood. Now that tends to be the main criticism when you take a UK show and kind of turn it into an American TV series. A lot of shows get criticised for kind of like, making them into a typical Hollywood. I wouldn't go just as far as to say all the cast are sort of super attractive models, but if you look outside the main three, pretty much everyone is good looking in that show. Whilst if you have a look if I take the sort of the supporting characters, so we have a look at, in this show you have Nora, which is the girlfriend of the werewolf. She's a very attractive sort of Swedish American blonde, whilst in the UK version, and no disrespect to the actress, but she's certainly a very much average looking girl and kind of, not unattractive, but certainly not what you would call Hollywood. Yes, the vampires are both probably attractive men, and arguably both the female ghost characters are, if we're talking, are both kind of pretty in their own right as well. The other thing I would say with the US show, it probably, although the UK show is more like it now, the US show had started off with very much like an overreaching arc in their plot lines, whilst the UK show initially started with much more self-contained sort of stories within just the individual episodes. Now you did have a bit of sort of overreaching story, but generally speaking, the majority of shows, at least in the early seasons in the UK version, were more or less standalone episodes. So the UK version is probably smaller in scale, at least initially. As you get later on in the series, it maybe changes to maybe ape a little bit more of that American sort of style. The central premise obviously being like a vampire ghost and a werewolf, just trying to live a normal life in a house, and that was the sort of central premise. I would say the UK version has probably got a better sense of realism, however. It tends to be a little bit more not quite as grandiose and sort of just that little bit more extra sort of realistic edge to it. I would say the UK version has better characterization in its central characters, and it certainly has more comedy. Now, I'm not saying the US version is without comedy, but I would certainly say there's far more laughs in the UK version than the US version. As I said, the US version tends to be a bit more dramatic, whilst this version, the UK version, is maybe a bit more comedy in it. However, one thing I would say the UK version does have, it's possibly far more adult themes in it. Now, I'll take an episode in particular as an argument, because they kind of did the same episode in both the US and the UK series, and that is when a young boy kind of gets killed who lives across the road, and the vampire bit, Mitchell or Aiden, turns him into a vampire. It was in the US version it was actually a female vampire, but anyway, that turned him into a vampire. But it's more or less the same story. Now, but in the UK version, there was a lot of they dealt with kind of like paedophile themes there, and all the sort of neighbours thought that Mitchell was a paedophile, Mitchell being the vampire. So we didn't have that in the US version. Now I'm guessing it's possibly because of the censorship issues that they have in the US TV, but also there's a lot more sort of sexual situations in the UK version. There's one scene, for example, in a sort of like a later season, where there's kind of like a bit like a vampire S&M couple, really, and things like that. So generally speaking, overall, bit more adult, I would say, the UK version. Now, if we look at the actual characters themselves, so if you're a US fan and you haven't really seen much of the UK version, you may not be aware that they have actually replaced the entire cast with different actors. Now, they're not playing the same characters. So the initial vampire in the the UK version was a guy called Mitchell. His character was called Mitchell. In the US version, you have he's called Aidan. Aidan being the name of the actor who actually played Mitchell, interestingly enough. And they're obviously kind of meant to be the same type of character. Aidan, interestingly, was actually a lot older. I think he's meant to be around 250 years old, whilst Mitchell, the UK vampire, was created in World War II, so he's obviously a lot younger. But basically, they kind of they both were badass in their day and have kind of given up their sort of vampiric way to try and start their normal life with his best friends, the werewolf. So their kind of character is obviously meant to be the same sort of person, or there are differences in sort of characteristics there. Now, in later seasons in the UK version, the vampire Mitchell was replaced with a vampire called Hal, who is a completely separate character. Like Aidan, though, he's actually a lot older than Mitchell, and he's a bit more of a well-spoken kind of more gentlemanly, shall we say, vampire. But he maybe was possibly a bit, when he was kind of evil and in his heyday, he was maybe a bit almost like one of the major bad guys of times past. We come on to the ghosts. In the US version, you have a character called Sally. Now, she's obviously based off the UK character called Annie. So their storylines, I would say, are probably the most similar out of the sort of translations. So the difference is really, I would say, the Annie, the UK ghost, is maybe a little bit more of a wallflower. She's kind of a very, very much a sort of girl next door. Whilst Sally, the US version, does have a degree of that, I would say she's maybe a little bit more proactive and possibly a little bit of a stronger character, I would say, to be quite honest with you. In later seasons, you have the ghost in the UK version being replaced by a character called Alex, who is much more like a tomboy ghost. She's certainly a lot more proactive than Annie, and probably more so than Sally as well. It can be confusing, all these names, I have to say. Right, and in regards to the werewolf, so the werewolf character is probably like Mitchell and Aidan. They're obviously meant to be more or less the same character initially. So the werewolf character in the UK and the US is both meant to be a sort of a bit more of a kind of a geeky character. He's meant to be a bit more of a sop, really, a bit more of a kind of one of life's losers necessarily. But in the UK version, he's far more like that compared to, I would say, the US version. He's kind of like, they take it to a certain point with the US version, but he's still probably much more of your average bloke, I would say, in the US version. Whilst the UK version, he's like a very much what you would consider like a sort of computer nerdy type person, that sort of thing. And in later versions in the UK version, he was replaced with a character called Tom, who was the sort of the second werewolf character, and he was very much like he'd been living in the wild and was very childlike and not the sharpest tool in the box. So again, a different character. So that's your kind of your main characters, and I'll briefly talk about some of the supporting characters. So in the US version, as I've mentioned, you have Josh's girlfriend is called Nora, and she's a doctor in the hospital they work. Same with the UK version, except she's called Nina. The main difference here is obviously the US version is a lot more glamorous looking, and the UK version, she's kind of certainly more average looking woman, but I would say her character is slightly different. She's probably a lot more supportive of George in the UK version, whilst in the US version, Nora kind of seems to be their relationship more seems to be hanging on by the sort of skin of its teeth, right? It seems a lot stronger in the UK version. And the final character I'll talk about, really, who's the only other sort of like you would consider maybe major character, is depending on which version you're looking at. So you're looking at either Aidan or Mitchell's maker, so the vampire that made their respective vampire in their country. So in the US version, Aidan was made by Bishop. In the UK version, he was made by a vampire called Herrick. So they're the kind of characters, and again, they're both they're fairly similar characters actually. I think they're both portrayed as a police. They they're disguising themselves as a sort of a policeman in their kind of like respective roles. I think I preferred Herrick out of the two of them, if I'm completely honest with you. Now, at the main, going back to the main three characters, I'm actually on the fence in regards to the vampire. I probably would prefer Mitchell over Aidan, and I think I'd maybe definitely prefer Hal. In regards to the ghosts, I much prefer Sally over Annie. I didn't think Annie was the weakest character out of the three English ones. I find Sally quite funny. Now she was actually being replaced by Alex in this current season of Being Human in the UK, and I actually probably like her character a lot more than Annie's. But the problem is with her, we haven't seen much of her, and so this UK last series is only 6 episodes, and she was introduced in the previous series, but not until right at the end. So we've not seen much of Alex, to be honest with you. I do like her character, but it hasn't been all that long, so you're kind of not all that invested in her, I don't think. In regards to the werewolf, I much prefer Josh, the American werewolf. I think his character is probably a little bit more interesting than George. Although I know there'll be some people who much prefer George. There you go. So in regards to the actual storylines, in both series, you'll tend to have a kind of a werewolf's ongoing story, a ghost ongoing story, and a sort of vampire ongoing story. Now, generally speaking, I would say the UK version, the vampire stories are far better than the vampire stories in the US version. Even though some of them are meant to be kind of follow the same sort of path, the vampire stories in the UK are a lot more interesting than the US versions. I find the US vampire stories to be quite boring, to be honest with you. But I would say the ghost and the werewolf storylines are a lot better. I would have to say the UK version probably focuses more on the vampires than the other two. And that's possibly true of the US version, but I'd say it's less so. You do get more of an ongoing story with the other two than you do in the UK version. So each series has some other sort of bits and pieces that the other one doesn't have, or at least not yet anyway. So the US version, you've got witches in that one. You've got these purebred werewolves, which are sort of like almost like super werewolves. You've got kind of this vampire royalty. What's in the UK version? You've got the devil. The devil was introduced in this last season, and sort of demons, that kind of thing. You've also got zombies, or at least a zombie. Although I have a feeling we're going to see zombies in the US version at some point. And the sort of church and religion, I would say, is a bit more introduced in the UK version. So that should give you some idea about the differences between the characters of the two shows, really. The thing to remember is that season 1 of the US version was very much, they took stories straight from the UK version and translated them to a US one. They did sort of change some bits up, and they even took some stories from later seasons of the UK one and plopped them in season 1 of the US version. But from season 2, it kind of went on its completely separate direction. So it kind of is turned into a completely separate show. Now you can't say they live in the same universe, because there are some differences between like the species that I've mentioned. So you couldn't say, oh, this is happening in America while this one's happening in the UK. They're two separate universes. Now overall, which one do I actually like the best? It's a difficult decision, because I actually enjoy them both. And you have a lot of criticism about these sort of English shows that get remade in America. But I would have to say I think I prefer the American version. I just think it generally is probably keeps me interested more. But this last season of Being Human, I really am enjoying. But as an overall complete series, I think I like the US version that tiny little bit more. Now, the rest of my country are probably going to lynch me for saying that, but there it is. So, if you're a UK fan, I think you'll get a kick out of the American version. I would certainly say it's, it's worth watching. There are going to be some differences, and if you're one of these people who really sort of like just take a stand against like things being remade in America, then I'm probably not going to change your mind on that. But I think if you're just like, if you just like a good, vampire or supernatural TV show that isn't sort of overly glossy like Vampire Diaries and things like that, I think you enjoy the US version of Being Human. At the same time, if you're a US fan and you're interested, maybe having a look at the British version, you might find it a little bit more sort of gritty and a little bit sort of bit of a different take on what you've been watching in your US version. You may like it as a companion piece, but if you prefer your more streamlined American shows, then you may find some of the sort of the British sensibilities are maybe a little bit off-putting sometimes. Anyway, that's my opinion on the two shows. I like them both. Let me know which one you prefer if you have seen them both, and if you haven't seen one or the other, would you be tempted to watch the other show? Leave us a comment. I look forward to seeing you next time. See you later.